My name is Mark Kelly. I go by Mark Everett Kelly. Everett's my middle name. My background includes working at ESPN. Why I had to stop working at ESPN was also when I was younger, I was diagnosed with a rare cancer called rhabdomyosarcoma at age 16, which also ended my athletic career. And that's, I'm very lucky to survive that. Doctors told me I only had about 6 months to live at 16. So that kind of gave me perspective early in life on what was important. Surviving that, it was the hardest thing I'd ever been through. And I had to make some changes in my life. Obviously, I could no longer be an athlete anymore. Going to college was hard. Everything became a little harder after that because I went up with a couple of diseases from the radiation and chemotherapy, which still today I deal with as far as Crohn's disease and lymphedema in my right leg. So there are a couple of things that I still suffer from, which is why I had to stop working at ESPN in 2008. So I've always had to kind of adjust to what my health has been telling me. But in relating this to Jackie Robinson, there was a song called "Take Me Out to the Ballgame" that the authors who wrote it in 1908 had never been to a baseball game. And their understanding of what it must be like to go out and enjoy something when you are going somewhere and then you get the chance to go to a baseball game, it's supposed to take you out of your reality and put you into another reality that you can share with your girlfriend, your wife, your friends. It's supposed to take you and give you an experience that you remember, that you enjoy. Ask a lot of people if they can remember their first baseball game. Most of them will give you some kind of story about how they were affected by it. And studying Jackie Robinson, who's always been a hero of mine, because when I grew up on Long Island, my dad was a Yankee fan, so he had seen Jackie Robinson play, and she started working for the Mets when I was younger. I kind of got mad at him because I'm like, you grew up a Yankee fan, you got to win all those years, and now I'm a Met fan and I never win. But the Dodgers were kind of like that. The Dodgers were kind of cursed in their relation to New York City. The Yankees were seen as the great team, the Dodgers were seen as the little team. And if you saw how they succeeded all those years, the Yankees won championships, the Dodgers would come close but never really win. It goes back to Brooklyn itself was one of the third largest cities in the world in 1898. They decided to join New York City and lose that individuality, which I think still affects Brooklyn to this day. They call it the mistake of '98. And I think that kind of affected how they were seen overall, as they were nice, but they were New York City, which is what the Yankees became. So the Dodgers became, they called them bums. And their logo was a picture of a bum, because that's what, generally if you met people from Brooklyn, there's a certain attitude, a certain way they talk, but they definitely had pride in their team, and this is everything that represented Brooklyn. So they didn't have much success early on, but they became part of what New York City became part of when they started to have success. So Jackie Robinson, when he came along, this was still before 7 years before Brown versus the Board of Education. This was a year before Harry Truman segregated the Army. And it was 20 years before any major civil rights legislation, about 10 years before Martin Luther King Jr. So this came along at a time when maybe the country wasn't ready for something like this because it hadn't been seen before. Brad Fricke got motivated in how to do this because his experience in being a general manager and his background in religion told him that everybody needed a chance, everybody needed an opportunity to succeed. And coming out of World War II, that was what our country was starting to be about. So when you study the background of what happened at a certain time in history, you have to ask yourself certain questions. And so, okay. So you have to ask yourself what, who, and why, and how. Again, 2 years before segregation in the military, 7 years before Brown versus Board of Education, 10 years, and 2 decades before civil rights legislation. So they had a gentleman agreement, Major League Baseball, They formally introduced in 1867 when the Pennsylvania State Commission denied a team to, back then there was no National League and American League, they kind of got together and just played, wasn't professional yet. The National League wound up becoming professional in 1876, and then the American League wound up becoming at the turn of the century. But in 1887, what the International League did was they decided to allow no more new contracts to black ball players. There was only 2 that played during the late 19th century in the National League and in the American Association back then. Even though it was not something that was written down, the owners kind of agreed this was something we were not going to allow. And it was called the Gentleman Agreement, and that's kind of how baseball handled the issue of are African Americans going to be able to play in Major League Baseball? Well, there's nothing that says they can't, but nobody we felt is good enough to play, so they kind of hid it under that. And a lot of the players felt threatened because they would play exhibition games against each other, and they knew how good some of these players were. And so maybe they didn't want to be confronted with that. So there were a lot of different reasons why there was segregation at the beginning of the century. So why Jackie Robinson, and who was Jackie Robinson? Jackie Robinson was born on January 31st, 1919. And he was born in Cairo, Georgia. Family moved to California, to Pasadena. His dad left when he was only 6 months old. This was a guy who turned out to be a phenomenal athlete. Now, he came from a family of phenomenal athletes. He was the youngest in his family. His younger brother wound up winning the silver medal at the 1936 Olympics. If you also remember the 1936 Olympics, this is when Jesse Owens kind of told Hitler, where he could stick his thoughts, and dominated that as an African American, which I think people started to see in this country that this could be done. Joe Louis, along with winning the championship as a boxer, I think was another thing that made it easier for Jack. When Jackie Robinson came along, there was already success beforehand. So the other thing, though, that I think most people don't realize is the pressure that is on someone that had to prove what Jackie Robinson had to prove. As an athlete, he knew he was good enough. He started in 4 sports in high school and college. At Pasadena Junior College and at UCLA, he lettered in 4 sports: track, baseball, football, and basketball. He was also on a football team that had 4 other African Americans at a time that they didn't really have too many colored players playing college football back then. But so he was kind of used to not having to hear that he couldn't do something, because his ability, he could do it, and then wherever he played, he got a chance to do it. He was also a great tennis player. He wound up winning the doubles championship in high school. So there's really nothing he couldn't do as an athlete. So that's why, who Jackie Robinson was. So who was Brad Fricke? He was the guy that became general manager of the Dodgers in 1942. Brad Fricke was credited for building our minor league system. So he himself was a player. He was a very religious man. He was a Methodist, which Robinson was a Methodist too, which I think was another reason that Brad Fricke thought this could be done with Jackie Robinson. But he didn't succeed as a player. He only had like a 3-year career where he batted over .280 1 year, but the rest of the time playing, he was an awful defensive catcher, and he held the record for most consecutive stolen bases allowed in 1907 when he played for the New York Highlanders, who eventually became the New York Yankees. So he realized he wasn't going to have a career playing. He became a manager before World War I. After World War I, he joined the St. Louis Cardinals, where he was an on-field manager, and then he became team president. And then in 1925, probably the greatest thing that happened to him is the guy who he then hired as team president to replace him so he could manage, fired him. And he said, you were no longer going to be the manager, but your ability to develop talent is undeniable. I want you to be a general manager. And that's how he wound up being St. Louis's general manager. Now, St. Louis, the success they had outside of building the minor league system, which back then, if you had a player that you wanted, you could lose out in a bid to him. So he didn't think it was fair that being from St. Louis, he would lose out for players that went to teams that had more money. Like the New York teams had more money, they could bid more on a player, so that made them their property, where he wanted a system that was more fair. So he started buying minor league teams and then developed them so they would play for the Cardinals. The Cardinals won the World Series in 1926. They won the World Series in 1930. They were in the 1934 World Series when they beat the Tigers with a team called the Gas House Gang, which is that he was there with the manager, Frankie Fish. That was a very, let's just say, not a very moral team. They were a team where anything went. They hated to lose, and they played a very open, brash type of baseball due to certain guys that were on the team. One of them was supposed to be Jackie Robinson's first manager, who we'll learn about later. But the Cardinals had great success under him. His last year in 1942, they won 106 games. He decided to leave and join the Dodgers because Larry McPhail, who had hired the manager that was there now, went into World War II. Rickey thought he should leave the Cardinals, joined the Dodgers, and became team president for the Dodgers in 1942. And then when he was there, decided maybe this would be a good time to integrate baseball, something he kind of always wanted to do. But the success he had with the Cardinals in building that whole Cardinals system, Cardinals were kind of like the class of the National League, or like the New York Yankees of the National League. A lot of it had to do with Brad Fricke. So why could this happen now? Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis was introduced to baseball in 1919 after the Black Sox. They were a Chicago White Sox team in 1919. Was rumored to throw the World Series to the Cincinnati Reds. The weird thing about that is the Reds had more wins than them during the regular season. I don't know why the White Sox were considered such a favorite, but they were. When they lost the World Series, they investigated it. They brought them to trial. Then during trial, a bunch of things happened, like they lost the testimonies of a bunch of different people, and they decided that they couldn't go forward with it, and the case was thrown out. Major League Baseball knew they had a problem because they couldn't have players that were rumored to have been cheating and to throw games. They asked Mountain Landis to come in and say, we need your help, you gotta clean up the sport. He says, okay, I'll do it, but I can't worry about my job. I need a lifetime contract. And that's what he got. He dies on November 25th, 1944. He was a known racist. A lot of reasons why they didn't allow black players to play before then was because of him. There was an interesting player called William Matthews, who in 1905, before any of this happened, was rumored to go to the Boston Braves. He was from local Alabama in a town called Anderson, where I'm from, or where I live now. And then, again, pressure and the ability to give into it. Eventually, the manager was paid off. That's why he didn't get his shot. But I remember telling about that story and sending it to one of the local newspapers on the 74th anniversary of Jackie Robinson. Give you another idea, like Alabama has done a lot of things for Major League Baseball, including the Negro leagues. How they got started was here in Brickwood Field. So there's a lot of connections to Alabama in baseball history. William Matthews was one that almost happened, and he almost beat Jackie Robinson to it. But Landis dies on November 25th, 1944, and they need a new commissioner now because now they have the position. Happy Chandler is named new commissioner November 1st, 1945. Who is Happy Chandler? He was the governor of Kentucky, quit that to join the Senate, because one of the guys in the Senate had passed away. He took over his position. He left the Senate to become baseball commissioner. He takes over November 1st, 1945. Chandler was a good friend of Brad Fricke. That's the two of them sitting there together. So Brad Fricke saw, okay, maybe I got a chance now to introduce what I want to introduce because the commissioner will be open to it. And this is something that I won't have to fight him on. Now, when he introduced this to Major League Baseball, the owners voted 15-1 to not integrate, him being the one person that chose to, but it didn't matter because now he could overrule them because he had the commissioner's blessing. The other thing about Jackie Robinson and why he was asked to do this, there's a story that you see in the movie 42. Now, some of the things you see in the movies aren't true. There's a story with him and Pee Wee Reese that was dated wrong. It did happen, but it happened much later. It didn't happen during the 1947 season. Robinson was not a passive guy. So when Brad Fricke calls him in August of 1945, one of his coaches, Clyde Silkforth, he says, I want to see Robinson. I think he's the guy that can integrate baseball. Now, there were a lot of great black athletes that played in the Negro Leagues who were better than Jackie Robinson. Josh Gibson, Crew Papa Bell, Satchel Paige. So many of them had success against major leaguers and had reputations already of being great ball players. Robinson wasn't one of them. Robinson, his only year playing baseball at UCLA, hit .097 as a freshman. Okay, so it was probably his worst sport. But he played in 1945 for the Kansas City Monarchs after World War II, and Fricke liked something about him. Number one, he was educated because he went to college. Number two, he was in the military. Number three, this was a guy who he saw had the ability to see what was going on in society, and he didn't like things that were kind of unfair, especially racial. 1938, when he's at Pasadena Junior College, he's coming home from the movies with another friend of his. Friend starts singing. One of the cops gets annoyed, decides to give them trouble. Robinson reacted to it by being arrested because his friend was kind of not treated fairly or not given dignity because of his color. So, he wasn't a guy that was going to look or turn the other cheek. But that's what Brad Fricke wanted to see. He knew that in this opportunity, you might not get a second one if you don't handle it right. And back then, a lot of the thought was, if we don't handle this the right way, we're not going to get another chance at this. So how they needed to act that society would accept them is that they would not cause any problems, they would not fight back, they would not be arrogant or like uppity, as a term was used back then. And Robinson was a guy who wasn't afraid to, but he understood what his role was and what Brad Fricke was asking him to do. When Brad Fricke said to him, I want you to be strong enough to not fight back. And I think Robinson understood that, and that's why he was another guy that Brad Fricke saw as, this is the one who's going to make this happen and allow opportunities for other players. A guy like Josh Gibson, maybe it wouldn't. He was known as a hothead a little bit. Maybe he wouldn't have reacted as well as Robinson did. The other thing about Robinson, he was very religious. And Rachel Robinson, his wife, tells a story where after every game in 1947, they lived in a one-bedroom apartment that they rented from somebody. Okay? Now, they had a child, and they rented one room. That's the idea of kind of how things have changed for Major League ball players. He only got paid $5,000 for his rookie year. Okay? Now, your average salary for a rookie is about $600,000. So it's a little bit different. But Rachel said he prayed every night, and again, he was a Methodist, like Brad Fricke was. So that was, too, another way where society would see him as a moral guy, a family guy, which is who Jackie Robinson was. That's another reason why he was going to fit in. However, in the Army, he gets arrested in 1944, July 1944, because he won't go to the back of the bus, a segregated bus. He wound up being brought before the judge, and he was found not guilty, and he got an honorable discharge from the Army. But again, this was a guy who wasn't passive, he wasn't afraid of a fight, he just knew when to fight. So this is some of the documents in his court-martial. That's his request to be released from the Army. And this is him signing his first Dodger contract in November of 1946. November of 1945. So he gets brought in to meet Brad Fricke in August of 1945, signs a contract in October, November, it was dated November 1st. End of October is when they agree to a contract, signs it. He gets married in February of 1946, and then he gets sent to the minor leagues in March of 1946. Now, another thing Brad Fricke knew that he was the man for the job was when he met his wife, Rachel. Rachel Robinson, I had the pleasure of meeting back in the late 90s when I worked for ESPN. One of the classiest ladies you'll ever meet, sweet, kind, and she had a memory like you wouldn't believe. So She's still alive today. Still does a lot of interviews today. But that's how Brad Fricke knew, is if Jackie Robinson could get someone like Rachel Robinson, he's the right guy for the job. Just to give you an idea, guys, about the woman you marry. Maybe somebody's looking at it that way. So for Jackie, that was something that worked in his favor. This is their wedding, 1946. Then the other thing that Robinson was going to be a great fit at is the Dodgers played his style of baseball. Why did they play his style of baseball? In 1939, a guy called Leo DeRocha was introduced as manager. Those of you who don't know Leo DeRocha, he was a guy who played on the St. Louis Cardinals in the 1934 on that Gas House Gang team. He came from Hartford, basically was a criminal his whole life. He grew up with gangs. He was given a shot to play baseball to get away from gangs. He was introduced to baseball by an African-American friend, so he understood that there was a place coming for black ball players because he had played with them early on in his life when he grew up, and he knew that a lot of them would play and that their time was coming soon. The other thing that was bad for him, though, as far as baseball was that he didn't get along with his teammates because he would steal from them. He stole Babe Ruth's wallet. Babe Ruth never forgave him for it. And then made matters worse was in 1939 when the Dodgers hired him, a guy called Larry McPhail hired him. Babe Ruth wanted the job, thought he was going to get it, but the Dodgers only signed Babe Ruth to attract fans. They never took him seriously. DeRocha was given the job as player manager in 1939, and this is why. So, before DeRocha, from 1902 to 1938, seasons with 84 wins or more, the Dodgers only have 4 of them in their history. When he got there from 1939 to the year before Jackie Robinson became a Dodger, they had 6 seasons of 84 or more wins. They were always number 1 or number 2 in stolen bases and runs scored. I think 6 of the 8 years that he took over after 1939, being in the first, second, or third in the National League in those 3 categories, which was perfect for how Jackie Robinson played and how the Negro Leagues played, and why Jackie Robinson was a great fit for this type of baseball. So that's another reason why the Dodgers and Brad Fricke thought this would be a great time to introduce him to Major League Baseball. Is there's no denying that with DeRocha as his manager, they're going to play the style of baseball that benefits him. Dodgers didn't have much power, and they weren't going to develop their own ways of scoring by power hitting. They bunted a lot. They did a lot of sacrifices. They went from first to third on singles, and Robinson was great at that. You can see by how many runs they averaged. Before DeRocha got there, only 2 times did they average 5 or more runs per game. From 1939 to 1946, they did it twice, just in that span. In his first and second, the runs scored 5 times from 39 to 46, which is why Robinson would be a great fit. This is DeRocha early on in his career. That's him with Larry McPhail. That's him with Brad Fricke. That's him with Babe Ruth with the Dodgers. And that's him with Babe Ruth on the 1928 Yankees. DeRocha played for the 1928 Yankees. He literally wrote the book, Nice Guys Finish Last. One of the first books I read. If you knew about his personal life and the things that he had done and been through, you kind of understood why. That was another reason why Robinson was going to be a great fit for the Dodgers, because DeRocha would be a manager that wouldn't allow some of the antics to go on that were coming his way. He knew Robinson was going to be thrown at. He knew other teams were going to take advantage of him. He knew that other opponents were going to scream at him and cause situations to be much worse because of the situation. DeRocha was a guy that would have definitely stood up for him. And he argued with umpires. He was very brash, and he was very open to causing a problem. Brad Fricke said, if you gave him a problem, he would make it infinitely worse. And that was a good example of him on the field managing. This is him as a player with the Gas House Gang, the 1934 Cardinals. You can see they were a little crazy. And this is him as a manager. Always arguing. Would have been a great fit for Jackie Robinson in 1947. Now, one of the things that came up when Robinson was first there in their first spring training in 1946 Something that also happened that year was the Dodgers decided to move from the South over to Cuba to have spring training. Get them out of the deep South so there wouldn't be that much attention on them. There wouldn't be the racism that they faced in Cuba and Florida. So the Dodgers moved their spring training in 46 and 47 to Cuba, and they played some games in Latin and Central America. This was a team photo of the 1947 Dodgers. You notice one guy, this guy, Dixie Walker, was the guy who started a petition to not play with Robinson as a Dodger. And you got some of the other Dodger players to sign on. There were a couple players. Hugh Casey was a guy who said he used to make his arm stronger by throwing rocks at black children when he was little. So there were a lot of players who didn't want to accept Robinson as a teammate or as a person, forget about just as a teammate. So internally, how they were going to deal with that was, well, if we present a problem, we tell management that we're not going to play with them, maybe they'll listen to us and we won't have to go through this. Dixie Walker didn't want to face his friends where he was from. He was from Alabama. Didn't want to face his friends and say, well, you played with a black player and he would lose his business that he owned, or he would lose customers. He was afraid how it would look. And I think a lot of the players back then, because they had never experienced anything like that, they didn't realize that African Americans could play baseball. They had only seen them in a subservient role. So they always thought that they were better because of how they saw them. And Dixie Walker was one of those guys. So what happens? He and some of the other Dodger players decide to start a petition. Brad Fricke gets word of it. He tells DeRocha, you need to deal with this. DeRocha's still the manager then at that point. And DeRocha wasn't a guy you crossed. And if he told you something, the players listened. They were afraid of him because he was nuts. And they knew that if he was called to action, that they were going to have to answer for things they did. So what does he do? Well, the scene in the movie goes where he calls them down when they're most vulnerable, which was the middle of the night, gets them out of bed, half of them come down in their t-shirts or they're all unkept, they look horrible, and now he's going to punish them for what they're attempting to do. And he tells them, I don't care what Robinson looks like, if he's black, yellow, blue, green, if he's a zebra, if he can play, he's going to play. And more are coming, guys, and you better get used to it. And if you're not used to it, if you can't use the money, then we'll trade you. How many of you guys are going to have a problem with that? So some of them didn't answer, but there were still some, like Dixie Walker, who didn't know how he was going to handle it. So DeRocha says, you can pretty much know what I'm telling you to do with your petition. And he says, and I never want to hear another word from it again. And so that's how he dealt with it. The next day, Brad Fricke came to the minor league camp in Cuba, met with some of the players who guaranteed him that their play on the field wouldn't be affected. So even though they disagreed with what they were doing, they wouldn't let it affect their play. They would still give their best effort. That was good enough for Ricky to hear at that time, which Dixie Walker was the guy he needed because Walker was his top RBI guy. And one of the fan favorites in Brooklyn, who they called the People's Choice, because he was a clutch ball player, probably one of the best hitters on the Dodger team. He knew he was going to need them from 1947 season, so he had to deal with the fact that Walker was going to be uncomfortable with it. But as we wind up seeing, Robinson and his effect changed a lot of different things. But that's how it started. He gets sent to Montreal for the 1946 season. They figured that's the best place for him to be because it's a little out of the way, wouldn't have to deal with some of the pressures that you would have to if you were in another minor league city. So the Dodgers put him up in Montreal. And it's a great experience for him. He loves it. The people in Montreal accepted him. Being in Canada was entirely different than being in some of the places where he played. Now, he still had to play road games in some sites that were very unfavorable to him, but overall, his experience in Montreal was very good for 1946 and kind of helped him to understand that he could play. His first game playing against organized competition as a professional athlete was May 17, 1946, and he got 3 hits that game including a 3-run homer, and that was against the Brooklyn Dodgers, who were playing their minor league team, the Montreal Royals. So Robinson kind of got the idea that he could play right away, and he knew that he had the ability to play. But this is him during the 1946 season in Montreal. That's his manager, Clyde Sutherford, and that's him with some of his teammates. So how did he do overall that year? Well, 124 games, out of 349, led the league. 468 on-base percentage led the league. Slugging percentage 462, OPS, which is combined. On-base percentage is slugging 930, which is very good. Most players in Major League Baseball now, if you're up over 800, you're considered pretty good. 155 hits, led the league in runs. How did Montreal do overall in the league? Well, they went 154. They averaged 1.5 more runs than the second place team. So they dominated in the way that they played. They wound up winning the Governor's Championship. They won their division by 18.5 games. And the Governor's Championship was like their version of the World Series. Jackie Robinson wound up being named MVP of the championship. So if you didn't know if he could play already, this is a pretty good idea that he could. So before the 1947 season is going to start, this is beginning of April, the commissioner tells Leo DeRocha that he's going to be suspended for the 1947 season. Why? Well, I told you that he wasn't a very moral character. Okay, he was a guy that was known to be a thief and to steal and to do things kind of to get his advantage. However, he had to do it. This is him in the 1947 season. That was when he was suspended. This kind of explains why. He was a guy that dealt with gangsters. Growing up in Hartford, he lived with real gangsters. When he became manager of the Dodgers, he was married, got married in 1939, decided to get a divorce from his wife in 1943, because he only married her for her money, essentially. And he meets an actress called Lorraine Day, who has Hollywood ties. So he starts hanging out with the Hollywood crowd. So now he's not only friends with real gangsters, but he's friends with Hollywood gangsters, like George Raft, who's right there. George Raft was a guy who played with James Cagney in a lot of gangster roles. Okay? That's DeRocha, that's George Raft, that's Toots Shor, who owned a bar in New York City, and that's Joe DiMaggio right next to him. Okay, that's at the 1946 World Series. That's him with Frank Sinatra, and that's him and George Raft again with another Reds player. So he had these connections. The commissioner gets hold of it, finds out that during one of the off seasons, Bugsy Siegel had a party at his house. Bugsy Siegel was a gangster who was known for building Las Vegas. The commissioner finds out and says, look, you can't be doing this. And coach Major League Baseball, this sets a bad example, where the Catholic League was already mad at him because he got divorced. So now this kind of just added on, and they decided that they were going to boycott Dodger games in 1947 if DeRocha was the manager, because they didn't like the moral setting he had as manager of the Dodgers. Because he was still now starting to court Lorraine Day, who was an actress who was married. That's him with George Raft, that's Harpo Marx right there. That's John Wayne, one of the great actors, and that's when DeRocha was on the Munsters later on, and Herman Munster. So he was a guy that wound up having a Hollywood career, but these are the kind of people that he hung out with. Lorraine Day was an actress. Her problem was that she was married already. She decides to get divorced. However, in California, where she was married to a famous band leader. Even though you're divorced, you have to wait a year before you can remarry again. She doesn't care. They go to, her and DeRocha go to Mexico. They get married, where she's now seen, a judge now rules her as being married twice. He kind of holds her in contempt of court, says that she's committing bigamy. DeRocha himself is seen as a guy like who would do this and claim that you have any kind of morality. This is what they were dealing with in early 1947, right before the season started. The commissioner, now this is kind of the last straw for the commissioner. When he met with DeRocha in the offseason, he told DeRocha, if you comply to what I'm telling you to stay away from the gangsters, you'll be okay. This was a problem he didn't foresee, was that now DeRocha was going to be married to a woman who was seen by the law as being married twice. This created another problem as far as the media and how it looked. So they wound up replacing him with a guy called Bert Sutton. But one of the things that really was DeRoche's last thing that got him suspended was going back to gangsters. Larry McPhail, who hired him for the Dodgers, and was a guy that left World War II, who Brad Fricke took over for. When he came back after World War II, started working for the Yankees. He was another guy that had mobster connections. That's back then. If you were an owner of a team, you dealt with a lot of undesirables that would come to your games and try to work their way into your good graces. Before a spring training game in 1947, DeRoche sees him, Larry McPhail, in the crowd. They're now enemies, DeRoche and McPhail. Somehow, DeRoche, you wind up being an enemy of his if you knew him long enough, just because he was that kind of guy. And he sees Larry McPhail with these gangsters in the seats. And he goes nuts, and he says, how come, to the commissioner, how come I have to stay away from these guys, and he doesn't have to? That was it for the commissioner. The commissioner said, you know, there's a lot of different reasons why you're in the position you're in that don't have anything to do with this. I can't take this anymore. You've ruined all the chances you've had. Like I said, Brad Fricke said he would take a situation and make it infinitely worse. And so they decided they had to suspend him for the 1947 season. That was just something that people forget because of the impact that he would have had. I interviewed a guy a couple of years back called Peter Dolenbach, who was an author that wrote a number of books. One of them was on the Yankees in the 70s when they were known as the Bronx Zoo. And his grandfather was one of Jackie Robinson's attorneys in the 50s. And when I interviewed him, he got to meet Jackie Robinson in 1956, and he said Robinson would have really done well with DeRoche as the manager that first year, because he would have been able to protect him from a lot of things that were coming that year. So the fact that they didn't get to pair together, which would have been historic for both of them, it really kind of helped out Robinson in his overall cause, and DeRoche maybe helped his image a little bit. Would have helped his image being as a guy who maybe wasn't known as a criminal or a guy that hung out with gangsters, but as a guy that really did a great job in how to integrate baseball. That didn't happen. The next thing the Dodgers have to deal with is, who do we hire? Who's going to want this job? You get to come into a situation that you don't know what's going to happen. There could be explosions that happen because of this where you're now affected by the rest of your career if this doesn't go well. A couple guys that they asked, one of them was Joe McCarthy, who was manager of the Yankees, who had led them to championships. He doesn't want to do it. Clyde Sukforth, the guy that managed them in minor leagues, didn't want to do it. He says, I'll do it temporarily, but not for the season. So they get a guy called Bert Schotten, who was retired. He was a guy who lived in Florida. He decides to manage in street clothes because he's a very laid-back type of guy. Totally opposite of what Leo DeRoche is. He was kind of like a Joe Torre, if you remember Joe Torre, how he managed the Yankees, how he managed the teams. He would be a hands-off guy, kind of let the players be the players. That's who Schotten was. And his career as a manager and as a ball player wasn't that great. 271 career batting average, and as a manager, he only won 40% of his games when he managed the Phillies in the 1930s. So he wasn't the ideal guy to bring into this situation when you needed a manager that could take control of things if things got out of hand. Schotten wasn't that guy, but they're the guys who had, the Dodgers decided they wanted to go with. Number one, because he was one of the only people that would accept the job, and number two was because Brad Fricke knew that he had been around Major League Baseball before, and he was an older guy, so maybe things wouldn't affect him as they would a younger player or a younger manager. April 11th, 1947 is when this is from. On April 10th, the Dodgers announced that they have purchased Jackie Robinson's contract. They announced it during an exhibition game. Before the season, the Dodgers played exhibition games against other teams. They were playing against the Yankees that day. In the sixth inning, they announced Robinson is now going to become a member of the Dodgers, and he used to report immediately. Kind of took people offhand, even though they knew it was going to happen. Maybe they thought it would be delayed another year because it was so late in spring training. The Dodgers decided they're going to promote him then. The papers cover it on April 11th. So April 15th is now when he's going to make his debut at Evans Field. That's him signing his first major league contract with Brad Fricke, and that's the actual contract itself. April 15th is when he breaks in. The very first game they're playing the Boston Braves, he goes 0 for 3, but in his third at bat, he almost decapitates the third baseman with a line drive called Bob Elliott. Gets on first base, winds up scoring the winning run later in the game. And the Dodgers went on to win that game on April 15th against the Boston Braves, who wound up winning the division the next year and was a very good team back then in the late 40s. Some of the things Jackie Robinson dealt with that first year. That's a guy called Ben Chapman, who was manager of the Phillies. If you saw the movie 42, one of the uglier scenes is when Chapman really gets on him, starts calling him a lot of horrible things. Anything you could imagine that would denigrate your position as a man is what he said to Robinson. A lot of the Philly players were embarrassed by it, and a lot of the Dodgers were really angry about it. That's one of the things that started to turn how they thought about Robinson, is they saw no person should be treated like this. After the game, the Philly organization says to the manager, "You got to fix this." He doesn't want to, but he has to, according to their organization. Robinson doesn't want to either, but the Dodgers say, "No, you got to do this because this looks right." The guy who was really tormenting during the game said some horrible things. Robinson had to take a picture with him after the game. The reason why they're holding it back is because Robinson didn't want to touch him. Imagine having to do that. These are some of the things that he had to deal with. When you're a person that's trying to prove yourself in any situation, think about your jobs, think about things that you want to do. All you really ask for is a chance to be able to do that. And how many of us in our lives, we've gotten their chance, who knew how to act, knew what our responsibilities were, took it seriously and was able to do it, but we just needed to prove ourselves. That's kind of where Robinson found himself overall every day, and the amount of pressure that he was under every day to act right when, they say that courage is determined when nobody is watching you. What you do when nobody is watching you. But what if everybody is watching you? And what if they're watching you and they hate you and they want you to fail and they want you to not only fail, but fail miserably so you'll never do it again. And then you'll learn your place in society. And so that's what Robinson had to do with. The pressures of that, I don't know any other player that could have put up with that. Now, when you think of how it relates to today, like I get annoyed when I can't, when my remote doesn't work on my TV. So I can't imagine what real stress of this situation must have been like for Jackie Robinson, which I think for anybody was more than you would put on a normal human being. And most people couldn't understand it. Most people couldn't deal with it. But he knew what he had to deal with. That was one of the situations. You have to eat your ego and take a picture with a guy who's one of the worst people you've ever met in your life. The Dodgers, though, are winning. They're in first place in the beginning of June. Robinson, though, is struggling a little bit with his batting average. He didn't get off to a great start, but he's doing some things that are different. He gets on first base, he'll annoy the pitcher, he'll torment him to the point where the pitcher would be taken out of his game. That's how Robinson was able to get back at some of these guys. He couldn't fight with them, but he could take out his hostilities with the way he played. And if he got on first base, he was going to torment the pitcher to where they balked. The first time he scored a major league run was when the pitcher balked because he was on third base because he annoyed him so much. This is how he got back. He would also do things like bunt down the first baseline. This pitcher called Sal Maglie, who played for the New York Giants, they called him the barber because he would throw balls, up close, give you a close shave. How he would get back at him is he would bunt down the first baseline, and then when Maglie would have to cover first base, he'd be able to knock into him. That's kind of the way he would secretly do things that he couldn't do openly to get back at some of the players. There was a player called Enos Slaughter, who was a Hall of Famer, played for the Cardinals. At the end of one of his trips to first base, Slaughter spiked him. Robinson played first base, and when Slaughter ran by him, he clipped him and almost tore his Achilles. Robinson couldn't do anything about that then, but 2 years later, Slaughter tells the story where he doubles into the gap, where Robinson's out playing second base, and as he's rounding second and sliding into the bag, Robinson didn't really care about tagging him, slapped him with the ball, Slaughter lost 7 of his teeth, to the point where he bled so bad that they had to do an operation on his gums. And as he's getting up, Robinson said to him, "I never forget." So he knew he would have his opportunity to get back at some of those guys, depending on his success in 1947. So that's the Dodgers. As they go along, they start to have more and more success during the season. That's him with some of his teammates, Spider Jorgensen, Pee Wee Reese, and Cole Ferrillo. Again, some of his other teammates in 1947. And that's the kind of baseball he played, where he would torment the pitcher, where he would get a look like that on his face, and then the pitcher would either drop the ball or stop paying attention to the batter and give the batter something to hit. That's how Robinson affected the opposition. On September 23rd, 1947, they have Jackie Robinson Day at Everett Field, where they award him a car and they honor the success he had that year. He was named Rookie of the Year in 1947, the first ever in Major League Baseball history. They gave him the award 18 days before the season ended. Now they vote on it in November. That's him with the award. This was how he did that year. Scored a team-high 125 runs. He also led the team in home runs, tied with Pee Wee Reese. Led the team in hits runs, and he tied for lead in home runs. Where he really turned around his season was in early June, where he had a 21-game hitting streak, and over those 28 games batted .389 with 27 runs scored. They had first ever Rookie of the Year. Dodgers finished 94-60, winning the National League, and they played the Yankees in a World Series. 1947 World Series was one of the greatest World Series ever. A couple things that happened during that series. In Game 4, there was a Yankee pitcher called Bill Bevins, who came within 1 out of being the first pitcher to throw a no-hitter. He walked 10 guys, but he almost had the first no-hitter. Dodgers were losing 2-1 in the bottom of the ninth. They got 2 runners on base. A pinch hitter called Cookie Lavagetto hits one into the gap. Both Dodgers scored. They went up winning Game 4, 3-2. Series is tied at 2-2 going to Game 5 in Brooklyn. The Dodgers lose. In Game 6, they go back to Yankee Stadium. Reserve outfielder called Al Gianfrido robs Joe DiMaggio in one of the greatest defensive plays ever in World Series history. Stops the Yankee rally and forces Game 7. Dodgers lose in Game 7. However, losing to the Yankees was something the Dodgers did. 1947, they made the World Series, play the Yankees. Before that year, they had only made 3 World Series. One of them came in 1941. They lost to the Yankees in 5 games. They wound up playing the Yankees in 1949 in the World Series, in 1952, 53, 55, and 56. And only won 1. Okay? The Dodgers' success over that time, 47, they win the division or win the National League. 48, they qualified for a playoff, wound up losing to Boston in the playoff. 49, they won their league again. 1950, they lost on the last day of the season to the Phillies. 1951, they blew a 14-game lead. Bobby Thompson hit the shot hole around the world where the Giants came back and beat them in a 3-game playoff. So they didn't make the playoff that year. 52, they won franchise record 104 games, lost to the Yankees in the World Series. 53, won 100 games, lost to the Yankees in the World Series. 54, the Giants wound up winning the National League, but again, wound up winning in 55 and 56. So they had great success with Jackie Robinson, and the Dodgers became known as the Boys of Summer. And this was kind of how Robinson fit into that in 1947, being a team leader in some of those other categories. 1949, Robinson wound up winning MVP, the only year he wound up winning MVP in his Major League career. This is kind of the effect he had overall in his career. If you look at in Brooklyn Dodger history, most hits for a right-handed batter, 1 year, Jackie Robinson holds the record, 203. Now this is Brooklyn Dodger history. Most seasons scoring 99 runs or more. This is total Dodger history, including Los Angeles. Robinson has 7 seasons scoring 99 runs or more than any other Dodger player in team history. More than Duke Snider, more than Jim Gilliam, more than Gil Hodges, more than the players like Steve Garvey or Reggie Smith or Steve Sachs or whoever played for the Dodgers later on in their in their time in Los Angeles. Robinson is a guy that has done that more than anybody. So, most runs scored. This is from 1947 to 1953. The only one that scored more runs than him in Major League Baseball was Stan Musial, a Hall of Famer. Most hits over that time period. The only one that had more hits than him over that time period was, again, Stan Musial. So this is how Jackie Robinson, how good he was. Some of his numbers now, when they add the secondary information that they do now with all these different calculations and new statistics, he even ranks better. In a category called WAR, which is wins above replacement, which I could explain, but I probably bored you to death. Robinson ranks near one of the best, and the best at his position, second base. Overall, how did he affect Major League Baseball? The National League was a lot more open to giving roster spots to black players, not only black players, but Puerto Rican players, Spanish players. They integrated a lot faster than the American League was. From 1960 to 1985, in the All-Star game, the National League only lost 3 times. They wound up winning 24, losing 3 with 1 tie. That's because they had guys like Hank Aaron, Frank Robinson, Roberto Clemente, Willie McCovey, Juan Marichal. A lot of the guys that the National League gave the chance, Joe Morgan, and wound up breaking and being a main difference in why they dominated Major League Baseball over that time period. If you ask some of the players, Hank Aaron obviously wound up being one of the greatest players ever, but had 3,700 hits in his career. Plenty of teams could have signed Hank Aaron. Plenty of teams could have signed Willie Mays. He had a trial with the Red Sox. They didn't want to sign him. Red Sox were the last team to integrate in 1959. And they were an American League team. So this is overall the effect that Jackie Robinson had on Major League Baseball. This is him with his family, him and his kids, and Rachel. And that's him with Richard Nixon and Martin Luther King Jr. After his career was over, he wound up getting into politics. Wound up dying in 1972 after making a speech at the World Series, where he said, the only thing that's missing is seeing a black manager. Frank Robinson wound up being named first black manager a couple of years later as a player manager. The guy Robinson had a lot of respect for, and was another one of those guys who got his shot in the National League coming in with Cincinnati. So Robinson oversaw a lot of these things, the changes that would be made, but because he had diabetes and because of all the stress that he put himself through, ended up dying at a young age in 1952. In 1972. So I would have loved to have seen what Robinson could have done with 20 more years on this earth, and some of the things he could affect. But overall, he was a guy that saw things for how they were, wanted to improve them, but knew the reality of it was going to be a lot different than how it would look. And integrating baseball was one of those things. Behind the scenes, there were a lot of things he suffered from that he couldn't show, he couldn't let know, that he had to hold in, but the kind of character that's really developed when no one is looking, or when everyone is looking, is that you make the right choice. And he always did. I have my website's called CK Magic Sports, where I have a lot of the stuff I've written. I've written over 500 articles online. I did a podcast for a couple of years. I published a book of when I was sick with cancer and how I dealt with that. Another thing I really want to do is be able to teach sports history and teach media at school. So keep me in your thoughts because I'm trying to establish that here. But stuff like this that I love to do, it is very natural for me. Being able to share sports history, being able to share how it affects society, and the perspective that you get from it. A lot of things that I think are missing now, and teaching especially, is perspective, and how things relate to things that happened in our past, which to me is huge. And sports, you can't deny the role sports has had in American history and world history, and the people that have been introduced, like Muhammad Ali, like Michael Jordan, that have had overall effect on society, LeBron James, but because of sports. And that's really what I would love to do, is be able to teach young kids about that and tell them stories like I told you today. I love doing that. I love being able to connect and determine how I can help improve my place in society by helping other people see the accomplishments of people that came before me. So if you're interested to find out more about me, my website is ckmagicsports.com. I'm on YouTube. I have a channel on YouTube, but I'm not the greatest at social media because I'm a little bit older and I can't stand it. I don't like to be involved in some of those chat rooms. But I am very much in love with the idea of teaching children of the people that came before them and how they can understand history better. So, thank you. You guys any questions?
I just have one thing I do want to
Sure.
ask. Why did they trade Jackie Robinson in the end?
Well, a couple things happened with the Dodgers. I wanted to say, but I couldn't really make the presentation any longer. Walter O'Malley wound up taking over as team president, replaced Brad Fricke, kind of in a power struggle. And O'Malley wanted to keep the Dodgers in Brooklyn, but at the same time, the guy who really owned a lot of the real estate on Long Island in Brooklyn and New York wouldn't allow him to. He wouldn't sell him the property he needed. So O'Malley wound up taking the team to Los Angeles. Now Robinson never liked Walter O'Malley. He saw him as pushing out Brad Fricke, so he never really got along with him. At the end of the 1956 season, Robinson was now 37 years old, and he had struggled a little bit in 1956, and so they kind of saw the writing on the wall. Robinson didn't want to leave. He wanted to keep playing. So they thought their hand was forced. Now, O'Malley knew something that nobody else knew. He knew that the Dodgers were going to be moving from Brooklyn to Los Angeles. He goes to Jackie Robinson, says, I want you to retire. Robinson says, I'm not ready to retire, so he trades him to the Giants. Now, that's probably one of the worst things Robinson could imagine, is playing for a team that he hated. And the other thing was the Giants were now managed by Leo DeRocha, the guy who he should have gotten a chance to. And again, DeRocha eventually turned everybody into an enemy. Robinson was now his enemy. And the Dodgers and Giants hated each other to begin with. And DeRocha tells a story, and he actually did help a lot of the other African-American ball players. Monty Irvin, Willie Mays had great careers and got a lot of chances because of DeRocha, but him and Jackie Robinson didn't see eye to eye. During one of the games in 1951, after the game, the Dodgers thought they had wiped out the Giants and thought they were done for the 1951 season, so they sang to him. Back then, in the Polo Grounds, the locker rooms were kind of right next to each other. So the Dodgers, after the game, sang to him, the Giants are dead, the Giants are dead. And you could hear Robinson because he had a very distinct voice. And DeRocha heard that, specifically Robinson over everyone else. The funny thing was the Giants wound up coming back and winning the division that year. But that's the type of things that ball players did back then, is because of where they were in New York City, you could see Yankee Stadium sitting in the upper deck of the Polo Grounds where the Giants played. It was right across the river in Manhattan. And those three teams being in New York City, vying for publicity and for the right to be the best. You gotta remember, the Yankees made the World Series 47, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 55, 56, 57, 50, 59. So the Yankees were always in the World Series. The Giants made it in 51 and 54, the only 2 years the Dodgers weren't in it. So there was always a World Series going on in New York City from 1947 to 1964.
You said that initially baseball was his weakest sport. I think I saw in the picture it was football and maybe track and field or something like that. Why did he stick with baseball as his profession?
Well, he went playing football in 1941 in Honolulu, but basically baseball was just something he did. He was doing during that time in 1945, and because Brad Fricke saw these other characteristics in him, gave him his opportunity to play baseball. I don't know if Robinson would have stayed playing baseball. He played in the Negro Leagues back then, which probably the worst thing that happened out of this was the Negro Leagues disbanded a couple of years later, and a lot of people lost jobs because of that. But yet now they were getting opportunities they wouldn't have got before. But all the papers back then separate but equal, you had a lot of them writing for black teams, covering the Negro leagues that now tried to get jobs with the major leagues but couldn't. And some of that was being able to understand that some of those things were going to go away, but so many more opportunities were going to open up. And but Robinson just happened to be there at that time to play baseball. I don't know if he would have gotten a chance in some other sport. Maybe he would have, broke basketball, being a black player to play that too. I don't know, but this was the chance he got. There are a lot of other things you find out in a lot of the books I read about some of the things that went on during that season that if I went into would take forever. I talk fast enough as it is, but I try to get as much as I can, and so I really apologize. My girlfriend tells me all the time that I mumble and that I don't talk clearly enough. I apologize if I do that. I was just trying to give from memory too, because I didn't really go use any of my notes.
Yeah.
Try and explain things the best I can in a time limit that I have.
It was very interesting.
Oh,
Really
yes.
enjoyed it.
Good job.
Yeah?
Yeah. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I love doing this.
It shows.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to, because being from New York, trying to sell that down here when, I've accomplished a lot of things in my career, but nobody would know.
Well, you incorporated the Alabama ties too, which is
Yeah.
interesting.
That's something I really would like to do more. Is the start of the Negro Leagues really became with guys that worked in regular jobs, that worked in the coal mines. And how can we finance and work? Well, let's start playing baseball. And a lot of them were tied to their businesses. And that's how the league started. Rube Foster started the first official major league in 1920. And then that's how a lot of players wouldn't have gotten chances to play, got their start. But that started here in Alabama. Willie Mays is from Alabama. So many of players that were affected by the Major League Baseball back then came from those small teams and got their opportunity from those small teams. So that's a big part of Alabama history. And too, Rickwood Field is still around, and there's so much history there. That's something I would love to be able to do more. I've written an article on how that started, on how the Negro League started, specifically Rube Foster, who wound up dying way too young, and toward the end of his life, so because he had that obsession with playing baseball, kind of lost his mind, wound up being in a mental institution where he would have visions of being asked to pitch in the World Series. So it's a sad part to it too, but how they came to the decision to not allow black players after the Civil War, to me, was just based on the uncomfortability that players had. A guy called Cap Anson, who was a Hall of Famer, kind of led a revolt that he didn't want to play against black players because they were so much better than him. And that was the mentality. They knew they could play, and they didn't want to have to deal with that. My brother still refuses to recognize the accomplishments of Babe Ruth because he didn't play with black players. So there's a lot of people that look at baseball history now and say, it doesn't matter. If you're not playing against the best competition, we shouldn't recognize anything you do. So a lot of the things that they were trying to protect, they wanted to destroy, which is what you do when you don't face the things you're ignorant on. And so a lot of that was ignorance, a lot of that was fear, and that's why they didn't get their opportunity to. But there were players like Bill Veeck, who wound up being a general manager. He wanted to integrate with the Phillies because he knew there was so much talent. And that's the thing maybe about Brad Fricke that wasn't as genuine as he knew this would make him money. And it did. So he benefited from it in a lot of ways. So I don't always buy it was he did it because it was the right thing. That was part of it. But if he wasn't going to make money, I don't know if he would have been as open to it as he was. That's the part that people like to glorify, some of those things. There's another story about him and Pee Wee Reese, where Pee Wee went over to him and put his arm around him in Cincinnati. That's a myth. That was supposed to happen May 2nd, 1937 at Crosley Field. People who were there in attendance that day said Crosley Field in Cincinnati was one of the places that really accepted him. Crosley Field was in an area of Cincinnati that was predominantly black, and ones attending the games knew we had to act a certain way. we can't get in anybody's face about anything. We'll ruin it for Jackie. So a lot of that was how some of the people that would come to games, the behavior they were on. So there was very little places that you would get blacks reacting to anything because they wanted Jackie to succeed. So that story, I think, is a little bit of a myth. Maybe it did happen later, but it didn't happen that year in 1947. There's a statue on it in New York. It says May 13, 1947. So, but again, there's a ball player who played left field, Gene Hermansky, who's convinced he drove in Jackie Robinson with the winning one in that first game. He didn't. Eddie Stanky did. Doesn't matter. When you tell a story, it's about your version of history. And a lot of these guys don't change after 50, 60 years. So, thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it very much. I appreciate your support.
Thank you.
Good job.